It's also a confirmation of what the church has proclaimed for millennia, that we are not made to be alone, but we are made for covenant.
Sociologist Dr. Brad Wilcox speaking at this year's Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
So give today's young men and women the truth that they deserve. Pursue marriage, pursue it with intention, and pursue it in your 20s when the window is widest and the possibilities most open. The road ahead, of course, is not easy, but it leads somewhere worth going, and you, 20-somethings here, were made for this journey.
You can watch and listen to Dr. Brad Wilcox making the case for 20-something marriage from the 2026 Making the Case conference. For a $250 gift by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to video and audio recordings of the entire conference. Learn more at issuesetc.org.
I think the fate of Christianity in Europe should be very, very sobering for Christians in America and make them realize that nothing can be taken for granted at this point.
What you actually can affirm for your child is you are baptized. You don't need to be defined by this gender dysphoria that's nagging at you and trying to get you to carve up your body and make all these changes. You are actually defined by what God says.
Union with the flesh of Jesus. There is nothing greater than that. And American evangelicalism cannot say that. It's a disembodied Christ. There's no Jesus in the water, Jesus in the Word, Jesus in your ear, Jesus in your mouth.
All of the Lutherans from the very beginning to the very end teach not only that good works are to be done, but even the necessity of good works.
Grocery clerks in Tennessee love listening to Issues Etc.
We talk a lot about the declining fertility rates in the U.S., really worldwide with few exceptions. What people can't agree on is whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Here's the headline from the New York Times. Even in Utah, land of big love, families are getting smaller. Is there a religion ghost in the New York Times story? Greetings and welcome to Issues Etc. We're coming to you on this Friday afternoon, July the 31st. Thanks for tuning us in. Terry Mattingly will join us to talk about media coverage of declining fertility rates in Utah. Josh Wood will be alongside from Them Before Us to talk about attempts to eliminate the words mother and father and the protests their recent billboard campaign received. Then we'll be spending some time with Dr. Michael New. We'll talk about media coverage of the Trump administration's Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program. Terry Mattingly is Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McMeel Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades, he led the GetReligion.org website. Terry, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
Seems kind of strange to ask when talking about Utah, is there a religion ghost in the story?
Oh, there is a huge one. And I really can't believe that the Times left this gap in the story. Even though we talk all the time about the Pew Gap, PEW, and it's not the Pew Research Center, it's the actual pews people sit in, or folding chairs or whatever people have these days. You just simply have to mention it when you're dealing with a state like Utah. And that is, the more people go to church, the more likely they are to have children. You know, just where are their goals pushing them? For years now, I've been writing about this and quoting a story that ran in the late great, from my opinion, conservative journal called The Weekly Standard. And The Weekly Standard did a cover story called America's One-Child Policy. And of course, they're referring to the infamous policy that existed for many years in China, where you were only allowed to have one child. And their point was that in America, people have different reasons for having only one child or having no children at all. And it has a passage that I want to read to our listeners because it's perfect to understand what's missing from this New York Times story. So here we go. In a world where childbearing has no practical benefit, People have babies because they want to, either for self-fulfillment or as a moral imperative. Moral imperative, of course, is a euphemism for religious compulsion. There are stark differences in fertility between secular and religious people. Jumping down, because this is the big idea I want to try to get across. But on this question, there are two Americas today. A secular population that wants small families or no family at all, and a religious population that wants larger families. Religious affiliation is part of the story, but the real difference comes with church attendance. Among people who seldom or never go to church, 66% say that 0, 1, or 2 children is the ideal family size, and only 25% view 3 or more children as ideal. Among those who go to church monthly, the 3 or more number edges to 29%. But among those who attend church every week, 41% say 3 or more children is ideal, while only 47% think that a smaller family is preferable. Here's the big idea. Quote, when you meet couples with more than 3 children today, chances are they're making a cultural and theological statement. Okay, that was written a long time ago, but that's really true. So the point here is that the New York Times sort of understands that there's the old Utah, which it thinks of as Latter-day Saint, and that's it. And then they think there's a modern Utah in which many people, women in particular, are putting a higher priority on personal success, education, and career than on launching straight into family. And they even show how this has affected life to some degree inside the Latter-day Saints. But I would argue, and I wrote about this a couple of years ago, and I'll mention that in a second, the Mormon leaders know about the trends inside their own church. And they know that there are essentially 2 different LDS communities. So Utah is not one state, and it's not even a state with Latter-day Saints and then everybody else. I would argue that today Utah is 4 states. Latter-day Saints who don't go to services versus those that go all the time. Then you have the other Utah, which is highly secular. They're there for the skiing and tech jobs and whatever. And there's a growing and large population of people from other religious traditions in Utah. And I predict that you would find different fertility rates based on church attendance among those people. So the stereotypical secular versus Latter-day Saint Utah is just not enough, especially if you want to know what's actually driving the changes among the Latter-day Saints. And it's clear to me that the New York Times piece thinks it covered that just by simply saying a lot of people have decided there's more than one way to live your life, and they're willing to put off children for a while or not have children at all, and that's all perfectly normal. There is at Brigham Young University an actual research center dedicated to studying family life among the Latter-day Saints. And they have the Brigham Young University School of Family Life. And there's a person there, Brian Willoughby, at least at the time I wrote my column a number of years ago, this was his job, was to study what happens among young adults, among the Latter-day Saints, what the patterns are. And I don't know how you write this story without asking someone in the leadership of the Latter-day Saints, especially someone whose job it is to study it, without asking them, what is the difference in fertility rates between people who are active, who have a temple permit? They are active enough to be able to go inside one of the Mormon temples. What is the fertility difference between people who are, I think the term they use is Jack Mormons, people who call themselves culturally Mormon, like they are cultural Catholics, but they haven't been to their local stake in years, versus those whose lives are defined by their faith. The New York Times piece just doesn't get into that. And because of that, we don't really know the different tensions that are causing the fertility decline in Utah.
Does any of this explain, in the case of Utah, and here we are just talking about the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon theology behind large families?
No, the piece never gets into the theological issues at all. And you could make a case that plays a big role, but you could also make a case that just people who are active in church tend to have large families, and that is the theological statement right there. Their faith is defining their life. Just as I think if you did a study of Catholics in America, you would find that fertility rates are plummeting, but that you would find out that fertility rates are still more active among people who go to Mass every week, go to confession, or even are daily Mass Catholics. I think you would find that the weekly standard language is closer to the reality, which is that devout religious beliefs and practice is something that's in favor of family formation and the size of those families and their attitudes about having children. Once again, we don't really get to hear anyone talk about that in this piece. It's as if we want to, say, we're talking about Utah, wink, wink, and we all know those Mormons like to have big families. I especially, just parentheses for a second, I was really offended by the headline. Even in Utah, land of big love, and big love is in quotation marks. Families are getting smaller. Well, Big Love, I believe, was an HBO miniseries that was rated like R or PG-13, and it was about polygamy. And it was about, kind of the putting some realities inside the stereotypes of what polygamy is like by the people outside of the regular Latter-day Saint Church who still practice polygamy. But I thought it was interesting that the New York Times assumed it could use Big Love in quotation marks in a headline, a reference to a show that I think has been off the air about a decade now at HBO, and assume everybody would know what that means. And then I don't think there's a reference to that in the story. It's just like, once again, this story has too much wink, wink, we're talking about Utah in it.
So do the stories that you've read on this also deal with what I believe every reputable demographer says are the perils of a falling fertility rate for a society?
Or for a church, if you're going to assume that life in Utah is defined in large part, at least for half the state, for sure, but mainly when, let's face it, when one religious group makes up half the population of your state, what happens to that religious group matters to the state. So once again, you honestly needed to talk to the Latter-day Saints about what's happening among them. Now, I did this in a pair of columns on the marriage crisis and what religious groups are saying or not saying about trying to help more young adults prep for marriage and be interested in marriage or fulfill their own dreams for marriage. Those are different conditions, but they're all major factors in this trend. This man, Brian Willoughby of Brigham Young, the School for Family Life, he noted something happening within the active LDS community. And that is that everybody knows there's a theological belief that the Mormons should have lots of children. Okay, first of all, what is it? Is that a reality? Here's the key. How would active Latter-day Saints thinkers describe that belief and how it functions? I think that's a critical point. That would probably only take you a paragraph or two. But see, the Latter-day Saints have another part of their image, and that is that they're incredibly driven to be successful in the view of the Americans that they know often distrust them. I mean, and we think about the young people showing up at your door, the missionaries knocking on your door, and we also know that Mormons succeed tremendously in government work, whether it's military, whether it's the Secret Service and whatever, because a lot of them speak multiple languages because they trained to be LDS missionaries in other parts of the country. This is why if you ask Mitt Romney a question in French, he would rattle off right back in response in fluent French, which, and this is kind of funny, that the French considered his French language skills excellent and called attention to it. Or Jacqueline Onassis speaking French or whatever. But my point here is they have found in their studies, and the Latter-day Saints have done studies on this, that their own young people are getting caught between two different emphases in their own families, the families they grew up in, and the culture around them. And here's a quote from Brian Willoughby. "The key word is tension," he said. "Our numbers are, quote, not falling as fast, but our young people are feeling tensions between the patterns they see all around them and what they hear from their parents and religious leaders. We are seeing the same changes, only moving slower. The average age of people getting married is rising. Fertility rates are declining. We can no longer assume that religious young people are some kind of different species." And he mentioned that in particular, young women are getting a mixed signal about the importance of family and when a family starts. They're getting this message from the culture and sometimes from LDS culture that they need to be a success. And success is defined primarily in terms of college and graduate school degrees and the start of a career. And simply stated, Willoughby says they're placing higher priorities on the other life goals that they're hearing about. And they may be hearing these life goals from their own parents who are proud of them and want them to succeed. But what does success mean, and what is the timing of success? And they're certainly hearing it from school leaders, even LDS university leaders. They're hearing a mixed signal. And so here's another quote I want our listeners to think about, because if you had plugged this into the Times story, I think we would have a much more complex image of the Latter-day Saints. Willoughby says, quote, "Marriage becomes a transition in which they fear they will lose freedom or success. They hear everyone saying, you go to these schools, you get these degrees. You get job one that leads to job two. Don't let anything get in your way or get you off track. With this kind of head-down, serious relationships can be a distraction on the path to success. The heart isn't as important." That quote was, "What with this kind of head-down approach." I think I dropped a word out. But anyway, you can hear, in other words, that Latter-day Saints young people are hearing the same messages from the culture and even from their own families and the academic culture around them. And I found it fascinating how seriously the Latter-day Saint leaders are taking this. And I think that's something that, frankly, all church leaders should be taking this more seriously. He also mentioned another factor, which is that this would have made a great addition to the New York Times story. The Latter-day Saints, at least at the time of this writing, had far more young women who were active in their churches than young men. And they had far more young women looking to get married than young men. And frankly, they were beginning to worry that some of the young men just weren't cutting it in terms of being marriage material. And they made a decision, and this is, I'm getting to a journalism point here. They made a decision to start creating special congregations for young adults, allowing serious Latter-day Saint women and men to serve side by side, to be active in projects to help the needy, to help their congregation, to help the people around them. to where they could actually kind of look each other over and decide who's serious, who actually cares about their faith. And he said, we're finding that this is a way to introduce our own young people to each other in a way beyond social media, cell phones, regular dating, etc. But notice that that assumption is built on the fact that the more serious you are as a believer, the more likely you are to be interested in marriage and what your own faith teaches you about marriage and family. So you've got a pew gap among the young adults, and even among those in the pews, at least once a week, let's say. You have the highly active people that are most interested in the church's teachings, and you have those that are there, which is better than not being there, but they're not as serious about their own faith. Now, could we have expected the New York Times to have gotten this angle of the story? I think we could, because I can't believe they didn't, in their background research, run into the Brigham Young University School of Family Life. It's hard to run even a basic Google, let alone a Grok search, on the topic of fertility in Utah without hitting Brigham Young and without hitting the university's own studies of the issue. And the minute you open that door, you're going to hear about all kinds of things that would make for good reporting. If you're interested in what active Latter-day Saints think about marriage, family, the family size, having kids, what it means to be a success in life, would it have helped to have gone to an entire religious congregation packed with young singles and young adults who have just gotten married and talked to them about what they think of these questions? I would have, from a reporter's point of view, I would consider that easy fishing in a pond that's been prepped for easy fishing, if I can stretch that metaphor. Why didn't they talk to the Brigham Young University School of Family Life?
We're talking with Terry Mattingly about media coverage of declining fertility rates in Utah. He quotes Brad Wilcox in his piece. We'll find out why next.
And I think we have to ask, do today's Marxist activists have any reason to say that they hate above anyone else in the world the church leaders most celebrated by our cultural elites? Or do they find that their efforts are not only not hampered by Christian cultural elites, but are in fact helped by them?
Megan Basham of the Daily Wire, speaking at the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
We must resist the infiltrators and use our power in such a way that when those who oppose the cause of Christ are asked who they hate most in the world, they think of our names.
You can watch Megan Basham making the case against progressive influence in the church from this year's Making the Case conference. For a contribution of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch the entire conference. Learn more at issuesetc.org.
Smartest listeners in podcasting. You're listening to Issues Etc.
For nearly 140 years, the Lutheran Witness has taught the faith, defended it against error, and shown forth the great treasures of the Lutheran Church and biblical doctrine. We're continuing this legacy by publishing issues and articles that help you see the world from a Lutheran perspective and that teach biblical doctrine and show forth the treasures of God's Word. Visit our website to learn more and how to subscribe, witness.lcms.org. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.
Lutherans for Life assists for-life Christians in offering the hope and help of the good news of Jesus Christ to women with an untimely pregnancy, women, men, and families suffering under the guilt of an abortion, young people with questions and concerns about sexuality, and the elderly and those with disabilities or terminal illnesses. Learn more about LFL resources and forming a life team or life chapter, or becoming a life advocate by calling 888-364-LIFE. That is 888-364-5433, or by visiting lutheransforlife.org.
We are discussing media coverage of declining fertility rates in Utah with Terry Mattingly. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McNeil Universal Syndicate. Terry, why was it important for you to quote Brad Wilcox, who is the director of the National Marriage Project and also a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia?
Well, there you go. That's someone who's looking at the other half of Utah. That's the person who is emerging as one of the most quoted people, quite frankly, in the American media on issues of marriage formation, fertility, faith and family, etc. You have here someone who is very open about his Christian faith, yet he's also in a secular institution, the University of Virginia, and they're doing research that's being quoted by everyone. But see, if you're going to talk to Wilcox, and once again, that would have been a good call. Yeah, he could tell you a little bit about the Latter-day Saints, but not as much as the people at the BYU Family School. But he could have told you about the other half of Utah. In other words, if you're going to say, well, there's tech jobs and it's a beautiful place to live and we've got all these newcomers moving in, so Utah isn't what it used to be, Wilcox, in a couple of paragraphs, might be able to tell you what's happening in that other half of the state of Utah. The secular people versus the Southern Baptists, the evangelicals. There are people, believe it or not, who don't mind living in a culturally conservative state. There are other religious believers who go there. That got a little bit of coverage. Gosh, I'm getting old. I don't remember when this was, at least 10 or 15 years ago. Maybe 20, the Southern Baptist Convention held its annual meeting in Salt Lake City. And for the first time, you had national press interest to some degree of, well, are the Mormons there? I mean, are the Baptists there to attempt to win all the Latter-day Saints to the Baptist Church? Well, actually, no, they were starting. I mean, I'm sure they would be glad to win anybody into the Baptist faith, but they were there to start missions because of the growth of the population. And they were, in effect, interested in the other half of Utah, which is a theme in the New York Times story, but it's just assumed all those people are secular. And I would predict at some point a sizable part of the population is active in other Christian religious traditions. And if you're going to open that door, it helps to ask a few questions about it.
So, bottom line, worship attendance versus worship affiliation is a major factor in so many news stories. Why don't the media generally get this?
Part of it is because some denominations are good about these statistics and some of them are terrible. Another factor is that some denominations, mainline Protestants, whatever, some of them are shrinking and they don't want to talk about what's happening in their church memberships and their numbers. I mean, the Episcopalians, by the way, are, to their credit, are extremely blunt about the statistics they're willing to share about the decline in their own church. My column this week is about a subject in a vague sort of way related to some of this. It's about the fact that the Anglican Church of Canada, which is, according to some demographic studies, may be totally gone by 2040, which is not that far away, is one of the first churches that has actually come up now with proposed liturgies for the celebration of euthanasia. Prayers and a setting of the divine liturgy and stuff to help bring a religious message and ministry to people who've chosen to end their own lives. And you're gathered around their bedside doing a worship service before the doctors come in and end their life. Well, if you've got a church where your average member is 70 years old, that's a rather poignant image. Now, I mentioned that simply to say, to answer your question, journalists, even on the religion beat, know how hard it is to get accurate statistics about some of these issues. You and I, in talking in the past, this is why I've been stressing that in addition to talking about church membership and church attendance, It's time to start asking pastors, priests, rabbis, everybody, how many marriages are you doing? And how many baptisms are you doing? Because for some reason, churches take really good statistics about baptisms and people who are converting into the faith. And if you're in a church that practices infant baptism, you almost certainly have a statistic for infant baptisms versus adult convert baptisms. And all of those statistics are relevant to this. The number of infant baptisms in Roman Catholicism are just plummeting. And that's certainly a statistic that is related to fertility. But once again, when you go into a parish and you find out, well, who is having children, you find out it's the 20% of the parish that's incredibly active and is active in all of the Catholic sacraments. So we're back to the basic reality that the Weekly Standard story expressed so well, and that the New York Times story never mentions. It matters what you believe and how you practice those beliefs when it comes time to answering questions about marriage and family life.
And as you have pointed out, Terry, that insight, what you believe and practice, applies to, as you just said a few moments ago, virtually every aspect of one's life.
Yeah, and so, but if you're going to kind of base the appeal of this story on the fact that we're talking about this super religious state, and it's not just a state that's super religious, it's a state that's been famous for big families, and now even Utah is in decline. If you're going to make that statement, I think you don't just talk to the people who are basically saying what you want to hear them say. You may actually need to talk, again, I'll make this point again, Latter-day Saint leaders make it very easy for you to find people in their faith that know what's happening with marriage and family life patterns. They have experts on it, and these people don't mind talking. All you have to do is look them up.
Terry Mattingly, Senior Fellow on Communications and Culture at St. Constantine College in Houston, Texas. He writes Rational Sheep, a Substack newsletter on faith, family, and mass media. He's author of the National On Religion column for the Andrews McNeil Universal Syndicate, and for 2 decades, he led the GetReligion.org website. Terry, thanks.
Glad to be here.
We will talk about some protests of the use of the words mother and father with Josh Wood of Them Before Us after the break. What do Jesus and Paul teach about marriage, divorce, unchastity, and desertion? The Issues Etc. book of the month for July is Divorce and Remarriage, Ecclesiastical Discernment and Pastoral Care. This new resource is published by Concordia Publishing House. Their phone number, 1-800-325-3040. You can learn more about divorce and remarriage at issuesetc.org. Divorce and Remarriage by Dr. Ben Mays. The Issues Etc. book of the month for July.
Criticism.
Thank God that it's 5:01 and the show is over.
Commendation.
I am not a Lutheran, but I regularly listen to Issues Etc. and thank you for putting this on the air.
Conundrum.
A Catholic friend has come to our LCMS church, and he said, "Why do you say very God, a very God?" And I couldn't think of a good answer.
The Issues Etc. comment line, 618-223-8382.
Have you ever wanted to enter a program that teaches right habits and intellectual rigor as you apprehend the beautiful, the good, and the holy, all the while learning classical languages and reading classical texts? Do you want to be a classical scholar? I'm Dr. Charles Schultz, the new leader of the Classical Lutheran Education program at Concordia, Chicago. Learn more about this program at CUC by visiting cuchicago.edu, cuchicago.edu.
We love our on-demand listeners. You're listening to Issues Etc.
Well, the vocation of pastor, I would say, is a vocation that will bring you the greatest joy ever. That the Lord would use you to speak forth words of eternal life to his people, that he would use your mouth and your hands to deliver these gifts to his people.
Dr. Carl Beckwith, professor of historical theology at Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana.
I think in my mind there's no better place to be than Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and all should rejoice in the opportunity to come here to study for the ministry.
Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana, forms servants in Jesus Christ who teach the faithful, reach the lost, and care for all. For information on studying for the vocation of pastor, visit ctsfw.edu or call 1-800-481-2155. Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Hearing is taken for granted until you don't have it. It happens at all ages. Unfortunately, some are born deaf, others lose it gradually. The end is the same, a world of silence. The Epitha Lutheran Mission Society for Deaf Ministry serves the deaf and hard of hearing domestically and internationally. They're the only recognized service organization in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod devoted solely to the deaf of all ages. Learn more at elms-deaf.org.
You wouldn't think that the words father and mother would be controversial, especially given the fact that every man, woman, and child on earth has a father and a mother, but apparently those words are. Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Joining us to talk about protests against the use of the words father and mother, Josh Wood. He's the executive director of Them Before Us, author of a recent column for The Federalist titled "The Left Can't Erase Moms and Dads No Matter How Hard They Try." Josh, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for covering it.
Tell us about this recent billboard ad campaign that you conducted and its message.
Well, we put up a few billboards that said something that, we tried really hard to pick a phrase that everybody would agree with, and it just says, no child has two moms, no child has two dads. That's it. The moms and dads are in rainbow colors, and it drew quite a reaction.
Tell us about that reaction.
Well, it took a lot of people back, and many of them objected, using some what I think are red herrings and some good things for us to dive into. But most people were pretty upset by the billboards.
So how does this biological truth about children, mothers, and fathers threaten the ideology behind same-sex adoption and surrogacy?
Well, what that simple phrase does is it forces you to recognize that anytime you do see a child, and this could be my parents divorced, both of them got remarried. Anytime you see a child in a situation even like that, that doesn't mean that they have now two dads, three dads, four dads, and that was a lot of the pushback we got. Well, what about blended families? What about adoption? What about all these different things? And what people had trouble recognizing is that there is a biological fact that every child is born and are the product of these two specific people. And whether that family unit breaks down, which is something we should all mourn, or they're adopted by another family, which is a redemptive act, it doesn't erase the fact that that child has lost something to even make that scenario possible. And in the worst cases where this is intentional, because we talk about divorce, we talk about adoption, those are tragedies. No one stands at the altar on their wedding day planning their divorce. Nobody conceives a child and has to place them for adoption and celebrates it. These are tragedies that everyone agrees are just that, tragedies. But unfortunately, we have this whole industry now that does this loss on purpose, finances it, and even tries to celebrate it as progress. Well, our billboard speaks directly to that, saying that's wrong.
So how are children commodified under this ideology?
Well, it's pretty simple. This whole industry that I was just talking about that allows for sperm, egg, and womb in a marketplace to be assembled like a production line to deliver these children to any number of adults it is the definition of a commodity. It's something purchasable, transferable, and we have somehow in our society been led to believe that role, mother or father, is transferable. It's actually something you can put up for sale, and that title won't matter at all. You can just be a sperm donor, an egg donor. You're just a womb, and that will mean nothing to the child. And we've heard in the comment section from these adults saying, I'm not the child's mother, I'm just the egg donor. Well, what we find and categorize this on our website, thembeforeus.com, is these children, they don't take that classification just at its face. They'll call you mom. They'll call you dad, whether you want to be known as donor or not.
You say that this commodification of children really is a necessity under this ideology. How is that?
Well, it's because in order for a child to have two moms, that the group that pushes that ideology, it's not stepdads, it's not adoptees, it's not none of them are. No adoptive parent I know is looking at that child and saying, you actually lost nothing. That dad didn't matter. I'm your real dad. No, they all recognize. Adoptive families say, wait a second, you did lose something. That's a tragedy. We're sorry. The opposite ideology, this acquisition by two men unrelated to the child, that is commodification, and it's important to recognize that no child has two dads. So if he's been put in a situation where two men are raising him, we should be mourning for what the child has lost. And the reason this caused such a backlash is because it implies just that any child being raised by two moms is missing something. And that if it's missing and it's intentional, then the child is a victim of an adult desire. And we as a society should not stand idly by and allow adults to victimize children.
Tell us this story out of Florida about surrogacy and a Chinese man.
Well, it's the logical end of a commodification, a marketplace, is that kids are going to be treated as something that can be purchased, acquired, disposed of, and even returned. This Chinese man, and which we need to remember that surrogacy, where you rent a womb, is utilized by a lot of foreign nationals to acquire citizenship, a child and citizenship. These children born on our soil through our surrogates by foreign men oftentimes are then U.S. citizens, and at 18 years old sponsor their parents to become citizens themselves in our country. They are used as a tool to get citizenship. So this case, a Chinese man created triplets. This woman in Florida had the triplets. No one was there to pick them up. No, I mean, can you imagine? No one even checks in on the kid. No one was there at all. One of the children, not long after, a few months later, got RSV and actually passed away. And there was still no contact from the buyer, the parent who had initiated this purchase. And finally, when the surrogate, who has been with these children for months now, said, I'm going to move to terminate the rights of this man, and I'm going to try to adopt the children because they've lost something. They're in a terrible situation, a situation she helped create, and she's going to try to rectify it. It was at that point that he got his lawyers involved and actually got them taken from her. I believe a guy in an SUV showed up to take the children away. I mean, it was just this horrific situation. And now he is there in a legal fight, which this Florida AG has actually stepped into, to try to prevent these children from being taken into a new country away from the only woman they've ever known. Some people say that's a crazy story. I'm like, that is the definition of a marketplace. That is the commodification of a child. This is not surrogacy as an aberration. This is exactly what happens when we allow gestation to be sold, children to be acquired, and then as a society we call this, wow, look at us, look how much progress we've made.
There's also a tragic story from Canada recently that made the news. What is it?
Again, when we treat children as products, you don't receive them, right? You don't, like a child coming into the world through the loving embrace of a mother and father. When they get pregnant, they are receiving that child. They're grateful for that child. When you custom design a product, you're frustrated when that product has what you would deem a defect, right? That's what they think this was. It's two Canadian men who created this child through IVF, and when the scans showed the child had a cleft palate, they did not want this child that they deemed to have a defect. And so they demanded that the surrogate, who had the power over life and death of this child, that she end the life of the child for what is I went to college with a guy who had a cleft lip, and he got it fixed in the first day of his life. They wanted him to have his life ended because of this, and she fought back and ultimately did not go through with it because she had courage, and she's a lot more compassionate than these two men who wanted to buy this baby. And once they did, they got the child, they got his lip fixed, and now are suing her for the emotional damages that she caused them going through this ordeal.
How do we combat the ideology behind same-sex adoption and surrogacy?
Well, this is the billboard. This is exactly why we did it. We have only begun to understand the proliferation of evil that will come through all of these reproductive technologies. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface of external wombs and trust me, it gets way worse than this, guys. What fixes it? Ultimately, if we protect the right of a child and how they come into the world, and we demand that no child has two mothers, no child has two fathers, every child has a mother and a father whom they have a right to be known and loved and raised by, if at all possible. We understand there's circumstances of tragedy and neglect where we need to step in for the child, but whenever possible, holding that out as the ideal to protect that child's rights, that fixes all of this. If we just get that one thing right, let's protect the child's right to be known, loved, and raised by their mother and father.
Josh Wood is executive director of Them Before Us. He's author of a recent column for The Federalist titled The Left Can't Erase Moms and Dads No Matter How Hard They Try. We'll post a link to that on the Talk On Demand archives page at issuesetc.org. Josh, thanks.
Thank you.
When we return, Dr. Michael New of the Charlotte Lozier Institute joins us, who will be talking about the Trump administration's pregnancy prevention program.
The church's music from the 2nd century.
Shepherd of tender youth, guiding in love and truth.
The 6th century. The 12th century. The 16th century. The 21st century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
Contending for truth in an age of anti-truth. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
This is Pastor Matthew Harrison, President of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The LCMS operates the second largest parochial school system in the United States. What can you expect from a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school? There's one race, the human race. And Jesus died for the sins of every man, woman, and child from every land and every nation. Life begins at conception. All life is precious from womb to tomb, and every student, parent, and teacher is created in the very image of God. There's right and wrong, and we know which is which from the Ten Commandments. There are only two sexes, male and female. He created them. Marriage is the lifelong union of one man and one woman. There's such a thing as objective, absolute truth, and it's found in the person and work of Jesus Christ and His Word. To find a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod school near you, visit lcms.org/schools.